All right, everybody, welcome back to the GDFC podcast, episode 5, where we'll be taking a look at how we improve as a player and recognize areas to grow ourselves. I am your host, Brian Tabata, and I'm joined today by the Chicago Cowboy himself.
Hey, everybody, Nick Powell. Glad to meet you.
And we have our usual murderer's row of Dustin Quibido.
Hey guys, good to be back. If you haven't checked out the previous episode with the Custodia interview with Darren from Canhammer, check it out, man. Tremendous episode. Can't wait to see what happens next.
And last, and certainly not least, we have Brian Moore.
Oh, discovered by the Germans in 1904, they named it San Diego, which of course in German means
San Diego?
Ding, ding, ding.
I promise you guys, we're working on getting a fact checker in here. So
someone will get that reference.
Well, what is it?
It wasn't me. It definitely wasn't me.
I fully grasped the reference. I just didn't laugh, and I hope you're okay with that.
I knew it was from something. I was like, it's so dumb, it has to be. But
most people don't laugh at my references anyway.
The classic Anchorman reference.
Thank you.
the
the big Nick energy. I appreciate it. Now I don't feel like as much of a loser, which I am, of course.
Hey, man. We're all doing our best.
Nothing like having to explain your joke.
Those are the best
well, I
ones.
did it for you.
Thank you, Nick.
Well, it's better, we can just assume the audience is rolling in laughter in their seats, maybe swerving their car, just from the pure hysteria you've unleashed upon them with that reference.
Hope everybody's safe.
Yeah. So today's show, we'll start out by looking at, how do we develop ourselves as players? How do we pick areas to improve upon? And then some of the things that we practice in order to reach those goals. All right, so the main segment for today is really looking at ourselves and how do we improve ourselves as players. Now, in my mind, there's sort of two main approaches to improvement. I think you can either start with a clear picture of what an ideal 40k player looks like, construct goals to achieve that end image. And that's a lot of what we sort of built upon when we talked about the concept map sort of from last week and what are all the different aspects of a player. You would then, when you have a goal or an idea of where you want to go, you just start making small increments towards that new spot. Now, another approach to it is really sort of a self-discovery, sort of choose your own adventure, just picking an area of your game to sort of work on and start developing. Setting yourself new goals for things you notice from game to game, and just taking things sort of day to day. Now, for all you guys that are with me here today, what is your sort of approach, and how do you sort of look at weaknesses in your game or identify areas you need to work on?
I think for me, I'm much more, I think traditionally I've been much more in that second camp of, hey, this game, I was too aggressive too early, so next game, I'm going to try to practice more patience. Over the last, probably 6 months to a year, I've tried to be much more in that first camp of, hey, I had a new army or a poor game, and I want to learn this aspect of it, right? The deployment part. I'll work on that piece for a month and a half, 2 months, and really focus on that aspect for all the games that I play in that time span. And I think that sort of kind of marrying the two works really well for me.
What about you, Brian?
I'm going to say I was probably more in the former camp. I like to imagine what does the complete or the ideal 40k player, I envision that person. And I just ask myself, what would Dustin do? And usually the answer comes straight to me. So that seemed to work so well. No, but I agree with what Nick's saying.
So that's why you charge me all the time.
All the time, all day, every day. I like to think that I'm an orc. But no, to Nick's point, I do sort of a progression based. So just thinking about the start of 8th edition, I really focused on the phases first. Okay, I want to get my movement right. So the first couple of games, I'm practicing my movement. In my practice time, I'm working on that. Even before that, it's deployment. Then I'm going through the shooting. Okay, do I have my target priority right? Great. What do I need to work on there? Because I know that I only have so much mental bandwidth when I'm actually playing the game that I want to focus on improving very specifically in one area. That thing is for me approaching every game with this very specific goal that I want to improve upon, so that I can, make the right progressions, make the improvements, and then just keep making note of that. And by that time, it sort of becomes muscle memory. Then I can move on to the next progression of my skill set.
Then what about you, Dustin? How'd you go from starting the game in 8th edition to being 58th in LVO this year?
I like to think of it like a cocoon. You know, you start off as a caterpillar, and you develop over time, and then suddenly you bloom with beautiful wings.
What if you
But
turn into a moth?
that's
You're like, oh
possible.
no.
You know, moths are pretty cool too. I like to think I'm a very experimental player though, and part of that is because I do the luxury of being able to play all the time. I try to get at least one game in every single week. But being experimental for me, there's two techniques that I really rely upon. The one that I would suggest everyone at least give it a try is what I like to call the post game show. So after you're done with your game, have a conversation between yourself and your play partner, and say, okay, you know, on your list and on my list, you know, who do you think was the MVP? On my list and your list, who do you think was, you know, not the MVP? You know, the one who was kind of more dead weight for your side, and taking that feedback from your partner, as well as looking internally, that really helps you distill the list, because you can kind of cut the chaff and distill and distill and distill until you have that perfect list that isn't just perfect in the math hammer, but it's perfect in the way that you play it. And there is a big distinction between those things, and that you can only find that through personal experimentation, rather than just, you know, going through the thought exploration. The second part that I think is a little bit more detailed, and for the player who's wanting to make that jump from casual to competitive, is to really identify something specific. You know, what is today's experiment about? For me, the unit that I'm doing a lot of experimenting on right now is with Mega Knobs. So every time I'm bringing them to a game, I'm thinking very hard on very specific questions. So one game, the specific question might be, do I need to add more bonuses to their hits? Are they being consistent in melee? Another question I might ask is their shooting impactful enough to where I can rely upon it, you know, from game to game? And I answer that question, you know, yes or no, or maybe, and kind of start accumulating ideas, because the brain can only process so much. You play a game, and if you set a goal to just absorb everything, I think ultimately you absorb nothing, because your goal wasn't very, you know, realistic or realizable in terms of what you're going to achieve from that experimentation. So as you want to really take that list that you think is getting to a good space, get deeper and find very precise points that you want to test out.
So overall, long answer is to say you more sort of feel out your progress and kind of evaluate from game to game.
Yeah, I think you have to grow with your list. You grow as a player along with your list as well, because your skill is going to increase. And taking that experimental approach to it is definitely a big part of how I play. I think there's a ton to being a complete player in terms of having this huge, massive knowledge, but there is some gut level, there is some instinctual, there is some pieces that can only be tested and found through actual play. So get out there and play games, guys.
Yeah, I know for me, I think when I initially started out, it was definitely picking up skills sort of a la carte. I'd kind of like notice this thing, start doing it here, notice this thing, start doing it here. As I've progressed and I started to develop my own picture of what a good 40k player looks like, then I can kind of actually actively look at my skill set and start planning out how I want to practice and how I develop. So one thing you guys all sort of echoed was this idea of practicing specific things. So next thing I kind of want to talk about is, well, how do you identify the specific things that you want to look on? And I know, Dustin, you brought up the idea of this post-game analysis. So that's something I know we all love doing. We can talk for hours, even after a game concludes. So what are some of the questions that you guys look for in that post-game analysis to help you identify specific parts of your play to improve upon?
So, Brian, I'll take a stab at this one here. You know me, I'm a consultant, and I like to think about things pretty strategically. And so when I'm thinking about things specifically, like Dustin has said, I think we mentioned this earlier, we only have so much mental bandwidth. And I want to make sure that I'm focusing my attention on the things that are going to yield the maximum return for my gameplay. And so a lot of times people say that's at deployment. You can win or lose games at the deployment. Maybe you can't win them, but you can certainly lose them. So I want to focus on making sure that I'm deploying in a way that gives me a shot first. So let's break that down. Okay, great. So we got that out of the way. A lot of people say movement is king, movement wins games. I want to break that down. I want to figure out, was my movement effective and efficient for me? Did anything that I do in my movement, did that cost me the game? And so then I go through the other things that I think are the most impactful, from an overall game perspective for that particular mission, and break that down to think of the areas that I can impact in the game. What really cost me, or was it something minute? Like, if you're talking about the minutia of, oh, I don't know, like target priority is key, but at the end of the day, target priority is probably not nearly as important as making sure that your models were in the right place at the right time.
I think for me, one of the big things that I really look for in sort of that post-game analysis, the post-game show, as Dustin calls it, is I'll ask my opponent, have you played this faction before? And have you ever been beaten by this faction before? What was different about their list? What was different about how you played your list? What was different about how I played my list? And I'll go through some of that. And it's not always applicable, but when it is really eye-opening. I think one really good example was an RTT that I played in February. My first game, I lost. I was tabled and I lost. I was playing White Scars. He was playing Tau, and they had just gotten the new, Psychic Awakening book. He completely schooled me. And the biggest piece of development sort of from that post-game analysis was he had lost to White Scars like the week prior. With a list that was a little bit different than mine, but it was really what it came down to was just the patience in how I played the game, and got a little too aggressive too early, and it just kind of snowballed from there. And so I kind of already thought that about my gameplay in that specific instance, but hearing him say, yeah, if you would have waited another turn or two, like this other guy did one time, that was the difference, right? So to have him sort of cement that was really helpful as well.
And Dustin, you sort of mentioned picking your MVPs. How do you evaluate a unit's performance in-game to determine if it qualifies as an MVP?
I think the big part is ask the other person. I think your play partner is going to have so much more of a unbiased look at what units performed admirably, and they're going to have a different viewpoint on it too. One of the lightning moments for me when I was playing you was seeing the lone wolf. I'd always said, that stratagem's a waste of CP. Why would
Yes.
But then no, it's true. Like I saw you play with it, and I'm like, wow, do that every single game. It's incredible.
I try to. I really do try to.
If you're a Space Wolf player and you're not using Lone Wolf, let me tell you something. Lone Wolf all the way. But having that from your opponent, having it come from their mouth, I think is really educational. You also need to look more past than just the killing side. I think people focus too hard in terms of, okay, what unit of mine deleted a guy? That's something that you could really think about through Math Hammer. Think about, again, the very specific points of why that unit was so successful in that game. What choices that you had with that unit, because I think there's a lot of units that they get overlooked because the Math Hammer isn't there for them. But when they come to the table, in different scenarios, they perform really, really well in ways that people don't expect. And you're only going to see that if you're willing to try that experimentation and take that post-game analysis and evaluate why they actually performed in a cool way.
Yeah, and Dustin, I think you hit on a good point, especially getting your opponent's perspective. And one of the things I like to do is engage them with what were the major decision points throughout the game that you were contemplating, both from my perspective as a player and then the opponent, and trying to talk through them like tit for tat. And I find that better understanding what decisions my opponent was forced to make, and did they make the right ones or the wrong ones? And from my perspective, the decisions that I was forced to make, did I make the right ones or the wrong ones? And having those discussions, and it's almost like we played one game and now we're playing out mentally or theoretically another game or two, and then figuring out how could we have improved on our gameplay together through those different scenarios. And I think that's also a way to really help you improve your gameplay overall.
Hey, that's one of the reasons why sportsmanship is such a huge portion of being a complete player, because you're only going to have those really incredible conversations that lead to player growth by having a good game, by making sure that both players are having fun. That way, whenever all things are said and done, the dice is down, they're going to be willing to engage with you and have that cool conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think one of the ways you can really help your opponent is if you take a mental note in the game whenever they make a decision that sort of surprises you. It's not kind of what you expected them to do. You're not really sure why they're doing it. Sometimes it ends up being a disaster for them. You can tell them, oh, this was a mistake. But also sometimes it ends up being a disaster for you. And that's something to kind of take note. And really, the important thing is to understand why they were making those decisions. So revisiting that after the game provide a lot of insight for you.
I've seen that from some other players, and I don't do it myself, but I I really like the idea of it, of keeping the player's notebook or player's journal. You're keeping a tabulation of like, what's your win-loss record versus certain factions. That way it gives you some points to practice, or taking a couple of notes from each game. That way you can revisit it, because it's so easy to forget what happened in your game, even 2 hours from the last one.
Now, I think a big general idea, because I really like keeping track of the feeling in a game of I'm ahead or I'm a bit behind, and paying attention to when that moment shifts. Because Brian, you did talk about identifying these key decisions in the game.
Yeah.
And a lot of those, something will happen. All of a sudden you're like, oh man, I'm losing now, or I feel like I'm losing. So I think it's important identifying those moments, and then those key moments breaking down, well, what led up to me suddenly feeling like I'm now losing the game? What are some things I could have done different to avoid that feeling? And also then even comparing it to your opponent and say, at the bottom of turn 2 when I made this charge, did it feel like you were suddenly behind because I started feeling ahead? And if there's sort of agreement there, it means you're sort of accurately gauging the situation. And if they're not, it means you were missing something or misevaluating something, and that's something to be conscious of as well.
Yeah, that's a good point too, Brian. And I think that good players probably manage that. They probably maintain composure, and they're able to manage those feelings of, oh, I'm way ahead or I'm losing the game a little better than I would say probably newer players. But that is a very good point, because I think that most competitive players, it's a very tight game that you're playing. And when you start to have that feeling where I have to make bigger plays to get back in it, that's when you've lost the initiative, and it's, basically your opponent can just sit there and win the game if they do nothing, right? So usually what that ends up meaning is, did somebody make a decision that ultimately led to more risk than they needed to take at that point in time, and did that risk pay off or did it not pay off? And usually if it pays off, great, you have that feeling of coming ahead. If it didn't pay off, now you feel like you're more behind.
This is one of my favorite parts to watch as a tournament organizer. I love to go from table to table and look specifically for I call it the turning point, right? Because every match has that turning point where something happened, where the game was no longer a meeting of two evenly matched armies. This was the moment that changed everything for the game, that led to the one person's win. It's so electric to see, and it's incredible whenever you see one of the opponents realizes that's going to happen, and then the realization from the other person that it has happened. It's wonderful. And if you've never had a chance to actually be involved in organizing 40k tournaments, I encourage you to do so, because it is a really cool thing to experience from that third person perspective. And it's one thing you could look at from live streams also. That's why I think a lot of people love watching bat reports on YouTube, such as GDFCs, because you can see that turning point in the match, and that's always it's like the climax of a movie, right?
Yeah, I would say
that is nicely put, Dustin.
Yeah, and if you're not finding that, I think that's something that you can immediately start working on, because when you're both deploying, you're both at 2,000 points, theory even. So there has to be a turning point somewhere that leads to someone winning the game. So if you're not finding that yet, that's something you should start looking for. And you can start simply with a question to your opponent, like, "Hey, do you think the turning point? When did you start winning this game?" The answer might surprise you. You might learn something.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I was just going to say, the biggest thing to me from, taking the jump for, anybody that I talk to online, or a person who wants to make the jump into more of like a competitive minded player, that's the big thing, right? Hey, can you analyze where you suddenly were up or down, or watching other games, right? Watching bat reps, whatever. Can you find that pivot point? But, and if they can't, that's the biggest thing to me, is when they can't analyze that. That's, a teaching moment, right? Hey, that might mean you need more practice. That might mean you need to watch more games, watch more bat reps. I would kind of go back to Dustin's earlier advice of just get out and play more. I think that's the biggest thing that people can do. But I think that's such a key skill, is if you can start to see where that rising crescendo starts to sort of happen, and then when it finally hits, that's going to do wonders for your level of play.
Rising Crescendo might be the best faction ability in 9th edition. You heard it here first.
I've got physics jokes. I've got Harlequin references.
It's Big Nick energy.
I've seen Anchorman. We can do it all.
You're the only one picking up Brian's references so far, so you're doing.
I really
doing
appreciate having you here. I really appreciate it. In the nick of time.
Now, I think I want to dive in a little bit more to that too, and talking about recognizing these situations that don't work out as expected, because 40k is not a game of certainty. There's always a chance. There's always a risk, and I think being able to evaluate scenarios is a very important skill. And I think you have to very consciously recognize situations where the results don't go as you expect them to. It becomes very important to dissect the decisions you make in these scenarios and not the dice. I think as soon as you are willing to just blame the dice for a certain outcome, you very quickly give up and forfeit any chance to improve at all.
1,000% agree.
This is why everyone should buy gravity dice.
Gravity dice is a poor life decision. We'll talk about that on episode 6. But no, I think that's a big thing. Is you talk to people and they go, the dice didn't go my way. And if you have to rely on the dice rolling average for you to win, your game plan was off to begin with. And I think people don't realize, they go, cool, 7-inch charges. I'll just roll 7-inch charges all day. Well, no, you won't. You'll roll some 2s. You'll roll double 1s, right? Against
you can't roll 7-inch charges?
Fail, right?
You got to practice more dice rolling, guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the Yahtzee king. So
we can't all just play Yahtzee with our mother-in-laws, Dustin. But you have to understand that there's a standard deviation of that 7, that average 7, that is still very, very likely to happen, right? And so understanding all that stuff and understanding how you need to layer your bonuses and use the terrain and deployment to make sure that you don't have to rely on a 7-inch charge to win the game.
I think you hit on one of the hallmarks of improving as a player is your risk management and mitigating risk, period. Mm-hmm. The more you can layer on the abilities to mitigate a negative outcome for a decision, that's when you're starting to improve as a player in your decision making.
It's just variance control, right? It's how do I make sure that no matter what I roll on these dice, I'm going to get close to or over the result I need, right?
Yeah, and let's say the game comes down to I'm making this 9-inch charge out of reserves, and you fail it, and you're like, okay, that's what cost me the game. I think, as you mentioned, you have to go back and look at what decisions leading up to that point let me put the fate of the game on the line of this charge. Was there something else I could have done? So they didn't have to make this 9-inch charge to win the game. Where else did I fit? Where else could I have made up these sort of deficits?
Yeah, what other units could I have, not gotten so aggressive with early that might have been around in the late game that could have helped, roll 2 units into this combat to try to take it out, right? Or there's a bunch of different examples. But I'm by trade, I'm in sales, software sales, and we talk about second layer, third layer, fourth layer questions with the reps that we manage all the time about how to really kind of get in with a client and understand what their true pain is that we can go and try to solve with one of our solutions. And I think it applies to really anything, but this game specifically, in that, the first layer answer of why did you lose was I failed the charge. The second layer answer might be because my chaplain failed his litany. The third layer, answer might be, and my centurions got fed to the Riptide on turn 2 instead of turn 4. And the fourth layer answer might be, well, I should have spent the CP. Maybe I should have spent that CP on Master of Sanctity to get the reroll on the litany or whatever, right? There's different things that happened even in the list building phase that ended up impacting how that game played out, right? And so I think understanding where that tipping point again is, and that it might have been in the list building phase, it might have been in deployment, it might have been in pre-game stratagem decisions.
The big one I found for me, particularly as a combat player, was I'd be like, oh man, I didn't make these charges, or I didn't get this up in. I was like, no, wait a minute. When I looked at the actual game state, I was winning the game, or I was in no rush to make that charge. So why did I go for these long charges, even a 7-inch charge? Something that you'd say you'll make more often than not, but you still have a very realistic chance of failing. When the right play, when I thought about it, was like, I should have just waited, right? Be more patient, hold back, because the opponent is forced to move to me. Guess what? That makes my charge shorter, less likely to fail it, more likely to succeed. And I don't have to make that big risk early. If the game is pretty even, I can wait to take that chance later on.
One of the key components of improving as a player is something you just hit on. Understanding when you have the upper hand and you literally don't have to do anything but continue to sit on these objectives and do what you're doing to win the game. And oftentimes newer players or less experienced players don't realize that they're in that upper hand position and then they overextend, and then they end up losing the game. And when you know that that's where you're at, I think that's when you need to just think, okay, now what do I need to change? Do I need to be more passive? Do I need to be more aggressive? Do I need to be a little bit more conservative? Manage my risk? What do I need to do in this position? And understanding when you're there is a key aspect of starting to get to that next skill level as a player.
Totally agree. And on that note too, I see a lot of time newer players online or in person, they'll say, well, how do you learn how do you learn to analyze the situation to know that you're in that situation, right? And I think it seems like this very tough, you must have played thousands of games to learn how to do that, et cetera, but not really. I think any player, even a brand new player, if you sit there and talk out the last 2 turns of a game, which happens all the time, right? You get to turn 4, time out, you say, well, let's just talk through the last 2 turns and see what would have happened, right? There's sort of an innate understanding just from knowing the sort of the basic rules of the game of how to do that, right? Okay, well, my unit probably would have done this, yours would have done this. It's basically that analysis, just a little bit more higher level thinking, starting at just for your own units and for your opponent's units, starting at like turn 3 or whatever, turn you might have the upper hand. So there's sort of this innate understanding of how to do that. I think players need to intentionally make it a goal to specifically analyze that tipping point, right? And go through those mental exercises of, hey, this turn, if I do this, this will be the outcome. Pretend you're talking it out with your opponent at the end of the game, and that'll sort of ease you into that mindset.
So, Nick, one thing that I want to add, and I promise I'll shut up after this. They have there's that saying that you have to imagine the ball going in, right? Like if you're taking to take the shot, you have to envision it going in. And this is to your point and Dustin's point about you just got to play the games, because as you progress as a player, you envision your victory even before you start to play the game. You know what your 5 to 6 turn game plan is and how you're going to win over the course of a 6-turn game. And so that's kind of, in my opinion, that's imagine the ball going through the hoop, right? And so as you play each round, is that going according to plan? And if it's yes, then you know that everything's coming up Millhouse for you. But you don't really get that experience sometimes until you continue to play and say, oh yeah, this is how I've won these past couple of games because this is how it played out. And then you have that understanding of, okay, now I know how this goes. So I don't know. I just think that's something that's interesting because a lot of players probably don't understand how does winning look like or how does losing look like. They don't even think about that. They just go up to the table, they roll dice and, oh, I lost this game. Okay, cool. Or, hey, I won this game. Don't really know why. Cool.
Well, and so many players don't play games. They play 2 turns of a game and then somebody forfeits.
Exactly right.
So I think that
gotta play 6. You got to play every round.
Absolutely. That is a huge issue and some of it's not in your control as a player. If your opponent's not having a good time or they have the feel bads and
or your wife is
don't want
calling
to
you
play
home
anymore, or if your loved ones are calling you home because they haven't seen you in days and the children are hungry, absolutely. But there's a degree of lack of control over that stuff. But I think as a community, if we decide that, that's not acceptable. As a community, we decide we all want to get better and we want to make sure we're playing out our games, because that's when you start to see some of that nuance, right? If you're only playing 2 turns of a game, you have very limited the number of data points for determining where the game sort of fell out of your grasp or was securely in your grasp. There's so few of them, it's almost not meaningful, right? So I think you need to play the full 5 or 6 turns, or 5 turns, or whatever 9th edition ends up being, in order to get the experience, right? And playing 3 5-turn, 6-turn games is going to be infinitely better than playing 10 2-turn games. I promise you.
Another very important part we sort of talked about was, analyzing your decisions and comparing what you expect versus what actually happens. And for newer players, especially, the most you see this is in shooting and combat. Someone will either kill much less than they expected to, quickly blame the dice. But I think a lot of times you'll realize that, or the results are well within normal variance and normal expectancy. And having an understanding of what your units are actually capable is probably one of the most valuable things you get from experience of just playing a list over and over, or playing a specific army over and over.
So I have a good example too on this one, Brian. And I don't know if we want to keep going through like all of the minutia of this stuff. But Nick, you hit a good point, because in that one tournament where I faced a very similar Brohammer-esque type of Iron Hands list, I had 2 Talos going into a squad of 5 intercessors round 3, so I'm hitting on 2s, and typically I'm used to just blendering regular intercessors, but I didn't factor into the 5+ invulnerable with the 5+ feel no pain, and when I killed one of them, I realized, oh boy, I really underestimated their durability and overestimated my Talos ability to take out these Iron Hand infantry. And that's part of experience, and that's part of just not really evaluating the durability of my opponent's units as they should have been.
And I also think that speaks to, it's easy to say 5-up, feel no pain. Okay, cool. I know that's going to help you save, 33% of the wounds that I'm going to do to you. But in my head, quick math, I still think I'm going to do that. It's not as intuitive to go, okay, but you also have, the 5-up. You've got all these different like other layered bonuses, the invuln, etc. It's not as intuitive for the human brain to like do all of those calculations on top of it, right? So I think
Right.
that's what you're speaking to, and so having something like a combat calculator to help you sort of during list building and during play to sort of quickly analyze like it feels like I can do this. Can I statistically within like standard deviation do this? Will it accomplish what I want this unit to do? To Dustin's point, leaning on tools like that is okay, and I think that's something players need to understand as well as they're learning to get better.
Yeah, I think the tools and experience support each other, and you can supplant one with the other depending on which area you're weak is. If you're newer, you just don't have the experience. So sometimes doing a few of these calculations can help you sort of see what is a realistic possibility. But if you've played your list 100 times, then you just know what are 5 intercessors capable of, what are 30 orc boys capable of. And the better you have an understanding of what they can actually do on the tabletop, the better you're moving those pieces around the table, and the better you're using them to execute your game plan in the game.
And getting that knowledge to a point where it's in your gut, it's in your heart, where you just feel as if you know what they're capable of is extremely important for tournament play as well, because the big boogeyman we haven't talked about is the clock. Especially if you're a horde player, you're constantly conscious of the clock. Where if I had time to pull out a calculator and figure out what my odds of winning a fight are, I would if I could, but I don't have that time. Every second I have is extraordinarily precious. So the more reps you get, the more practice you get, to where your play almost becomes instinctual is extremely important if you want to make sure you have those full 5 or 6 turns, whatever the tournament may be. That way you do place higher than you place as high as you would want to place.
Yeah, I mean, even just the mental exertion from having to make so many micro decisions, the more you sort of have this ingrained in your gut, the more of this knowledge you have chunked together will help a lot in speedy decision making and accurate decision making.
Yeah, exactly. Save your brain for other important decisions that you have to think about, especially in regards to the mission itself.
So again, the big takeaway really for us is just you got to analyze these situations you're in. Does the expected result match what actually happens? If it doesn't, right, that's a learning point for you, something to dig into. Why did it happen? Have those discussions with your opponent afterwards. It can help you really sort of improve your decision making in the game. The post-game analysis is a great way of doing that. You can also be sure to analyze the big moments in the game. When was the turning point? What was your MVP? And that can help guide you sort of specific things that you can sort of work on. So the last topic really for the day is sort of giving yourselves little goals, little improvements to make in your play. So let's say you finally identified the problem with your play. You've identified it a weakness, you're too aggressive, you're not patient enough. How do you go about working on it? How can you set yourself goals? How can you practice it your next game?
One thing that I do is, and so I set up little scenarios for myself all the time when I'm theory crafting, when I'm writing lists, when I'm watching a battle report, when after a tournament, whatever it might be, and I have specific, goals for those little scenarios that I set up, right? And so if the one I keep coming back to is the one I've learned most recently, which is patient play with my White Scar Centurions, because they hit like a brick, but only in the right spot and at the right time. And so I came back from a tournament where I got pasted by that Tau player, and I set up scenarios where I wanted to create I created the exact situation in terms of like the board layout of that game on the turn when I charged in, and I made myself wait another turn, another 2 turns to see, hey, what could have happened, right? And I think just for my specific example, it's, hey, I think I'm getting too aggressive too early, and so when I get that instinct to go charge in, I make myself wait in my practice scenarios.
Yeah, I would encourage people to set SMART goals. That's SMART, right? You want to make sure you're setting something specific. Make sure that they're measurable, right? You should be able to see the effect of what you're doing. Number 3, right? They should be achievable as well. You don't want to say, my goal is I'm going to go win LVO for being a brand new player, right? You want to sort of set it just difficult, one step above where you're currently at now. They should be relevant to what you're trying to achieve. If you want to be a more patient player, make sure they're relevant to that goal. And then time-based. You can just say, in my next game, I'm going to be doing this thing. Or for this tournament, I'm going to be focusing on this one thing. What are some of the goals that you guys have set for yourself and that have helped you sort of improve your play? Or things that you've focused on working on and improved your play?
One thing that I worked a lot on in terms of improving my tournament play was speed of play. It's vitally important if you want to move further in organized play, as well as be a more sportsmanlike opponent and partner, the person that you're playing with. And to Brian's point, smart objectives are fantastic to have whenever you're looking at it from a theoretical perspective, but also from an experimental perspective. One piece of advice I can give you is, we can't play in a tournament every weekend. That's just the reality of it, or at least most of us can't. But if you want to be a 40k badass, like Goku level, what you got to find is you got to find yourself a Vegeta. You got to find someone that you can spar with. Absolutely, right? Like, if you want to go Super Saiyan in this hobby, the only way you're going to do it is if you have someone who you can spar with, who you can come to the table and say, hey, I've got this thing that I want to experiment with. I want to check it out. I've got these goals. I got these objectives. Play it through with me. At the end of the show, let's talk about it, see if I hit those goals. And that sparring partner is going to really help you grow in a lot of ways. Like, I had a couple of people at my home store that I played with quite often, and they came with that approach where I said, look, I'm really practicing on speed, because if I don't get faster, like, I'm going to time out in all my games. And they were happy to play through me with that goal. And I think I showed a lot of improvement in terms of getting faster with my play, and it helped a ton.
Oh, Kakarot, that was nicely put.
I feel like I'm more of a Krillin most of the time.
So does that make Nick Yamcha?
It's Yamcha. Explains why he's not here most of the time.
Yamcha's here.
I'm not a Dragon Ball Z guy. I recognize these names.
Yeah, you're a Yamcha.
You don't want to know what this reference means for you, buddy.
Can I be Bulma? Is that a thing? Can I be?
You could be Master Roshi. What about you, Brian? What are some goals you're working on for your play right now?
I want to speak to CP management. I know that's something that, Brian, we've talked about on and off throughout 8th edition. And Nick, you actually had a really nice article for Grimdark Filthy Casuals about command point planning in the pregame and deployment, and would love to continue that those thoughts as we head into 9th. But one of the things that I found myself doing very early on in 8th edition was just blowing all of my CP turns 1 and 2, trying to go for that big alpha strike, try to wipe my opponent off the face of the table in the first 2 turns. And then you realize when you play some more competitive players, better players, that it's a much more tactical game, and you can't always just put all of your eggs in that big play basket. So how are you going to budget your CP throughout the course of a 6-turn game? What are the critical stratagems, or what are the critical things that you need to plan for? Is it an interrupt? Is it a fight twice? Is it a vect? Whatever it might be. And then can you execute your vision based on managing your CP accordingly? So that's something I've worked actively on throughout 8th edition. And I know that's going to be such a vital skill to learn in 9th edition. And I really do believe that that's going to set apart good players from great players, and great players from the best players.
For sure. And I think an important aspect of that too is, if something is working for you, that doesn't necessarily mean it's optimal. You might be getting away with suboptimal play in some cases. So sometimes pushing your limit on the extreme opposite end is good. But if you are spending all that CP early, well, what is it like when I spend none of it very early? And it sort of helps you find that middle ground and sort of that correct play. That's something I really sort of pushed myself. I knew just to start doing well in tournaments. I noticed in my ITC play, I was like, man, I'm not very good at picking my secondaries. There's always one I don't score very well. So I set myself a goal. I was like, my games, I'm always going to take one new secondary I haven't played with yet to familiarize myself how all these different secondaries play and what's sort of good and what's not. I could measure how many points I got for each secondary, and I could very readily see sort of how well it worked for me. And I quickly saw, it's like, oh, things like recon for my list seemed very attractive at first, but I found it was actually pulling my army apart, and I was able to sort of analyze my play that way. But ultimately, experimenting with a lot of the different secondaries, when they changed them at the start of this ITC season, it was actually very, very helpful for me because I was better able to analyze the effects of secondaries. And, some of my latest tournaments, I've actually maxed my secondaries in all my games, which had a big impact on doing well in the tournaments. All right, so a new segment for us. We have a couple of questions from some of the people on our Discord, and Andy is asking us, could be interesting to hear how everyone plays or builds lists differently in a narrative or more casual setting compared to a competitive one. So how do you guys address your lists from a narrative or competitive setting?
Yeah, I think, playing in a competitive setting is a lot of fun, but narrative and casual settings, I think, offer you a sort of a testing bed for new ideas. And so I use them to test list ideas, right? Because there's no real risk of failure. If you don't win, you were just there to roll dice and have fun anyway. And I also think it's easier to take a good list and play it to the level of your opponent than it is to take a poorly put together list and play it up to a skill level. And so you can always start a casual narrative game with a unique sort of experimental list, find out that it actually works really well, and then sort of slow your play down so that your opponent doesn't have to feel bad. So that's
there
how
he
I
is.
approach those.
Nick bringing competitive lists to casual events. All right, so Cameron is asking us.
Not like that.
Cameron from our Discord is asking us, how do you weigh the importance of capturing objectives and earning victory points against prioritization of destroying targets?
Oh, good question, Cameron. I'm going to try to answer this as succinctly as I can. The most important thing is understanding the mission packet that you're playing or what type of missions. And so for this example, I'm going to use ITC. The way that I like to think about this is what is my game plan for winning? So usually the first 1 to 3 turns, I'm trying to simply hold one objective, try to kill one thing, and deny a kill, which should get me hold, kill more. What that then does for me is towards the later rounds 4 through 6, then I'm looking to start to push out to the table to get hold more, still trying to get 1 kill, if not the bonus. And then usually what that does for me, if I'm playing to my game plan, is getting like a 2 to like a 8-point victory from that perspective. But usually for me, it's just staying with my game plan, not overextending to try to take care of too many threats, but just understanding what are the primary threats that my opponent has. And I'm not going to take what's not there. I'm going to try to just get my kill, but more importantly, just defend my own forces from giving up a kill.
All right, and Mr. Linderman, as a returning / newer player, I'd love to hear your thoughts on getting into 40k with 9th in mind. How will building your first army differ from older editions? Is pricing a factor? Will points increase mean getting everything in one hit to build a large army is no longer needed? Maybe the 500-point bracket is now a great place to start. For me, 9th edition and the smaller game modes means less front-loading of all the work it takes to get into the game. Because prior to this, small games always felt different. It didn't feel like you were playing 40k. You were just sort of biding your time to get to the big event, larger point games. So if the new games are engaging and feel like 40k, it just means you can start playing with your stuff much sooner. And our last question of the day is, I'd love to hear about some tips and strategies you guys use or think when it comes to deployment, since it's probably the most important stage of any game.
How you intend to deploy your forces needs to be something that you're considering really at the very beginning during your list building phase. And I would encourage you to practice deploying your list in various deployments. That way you see how it actually looks. In game, you also need to carefully consider primarily what are the ranges of your opponent's guns vis-a-vis your own, as well as how much deep strike that you're going to use, as well as how much you presume or see that your opponent is utilizing. So you be cognizant of deep strike denial, as well as just kind of the ranges of how close they're going to be to you on turn 2, turn 3. Secondaries are another major consideration, but honestly, this is an extremely deep topic. And as you said, this is a very, very important topic for winning games. Hopefully I can expound upon it in a full GDFC article once 9th hits. So stay tuned and check that out soon.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us. So don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find us on all the usual social media outlets. And if you guys have specific questions for us, feel free to get involved in our Discord channel. You can do that by emailing grimdarkfilthycasuals@gmail.com. We'll see you all out there on the battlefield.